many of the students with difference, they kind of go into these places wondering how they're going to be received and accepted, and wondering if the knowledge they bring to the classroom is valued or is it esteemed.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and leaders in the band community. Are you planning to travel with your group sometime soon? If so, please consider my sponsor, Kaleidoscope Adventures, a full-service tour company specializing in student group travel. With a former educator as its CEO, Kaleidoscope Adventures is dedicated to changing student lives through travel, and they offer high-quality service and an attention to detail that comes from more than 25 years of student travel experience. Trust Kaleidoscope's outstanding staff to focus on your group's one-of-a-kind adventure so that you can focus on everything else. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio-on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you knew one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now on to my next guest, Adrian Barnes. Hi, Adrian.
How you doing?
I'm doing great. So, Adrian, you and I met just recently. Can you introduce yourself for my listeners?
Sure. My name is Adrian Barnes, or Dr. Adrian Barnes. I'm an assistant professor of music education at Rowan University, Glassboro, New Jersey, and I'm also the coordinator of music education at Rowan University.
Excellent. Now, Adrian, you and I met just recently at NJMEA. We're both Florida State alumni. And so, go Seminoles.
Go Noles.
And so you and I have some other interesting connections that we'll talk about as we go on a little bit. But before we do, can you share your origin story for everyone? How'd you get started in music?
Absolutely. So I got started in music through an informal path through the Black church. That's where I kind of began my music journey and where I began to become trained in music. A lot of times, depending on your background, there's certain norms or practices or cultural practices that become a part of your music education journey or become a part of your path as a musician. And for me, that was becoming trained in the church. And so I got a chance to play drums. I got a chance to almost act as an apprentice, where I was working under other musicians, the organ player, the piano player, the drummer, until I was able to play by myself eventually and produce something. And it's kind of something cultural that happened in the Black church. You know, when you can walk, you can play an instrument, or you can sing, or you can dance, or you can do something. And it reminds me of the time when it was Black History Month at my church, and I was doing a poem based on John Coltrane. So my mother gives me a saxophone and says, go up there and read the poem. So I read the poem, and as I'm walking off, someone says, well, wait, aren't you going to play? I said, I can't actually play this thing. My mother just told me to put the horn on and go up there and read a poem. And they were like, well, you need to play something. Squeak out a note, do something. And that's kind of like the culture of Black churches. They'll give you an instrument, play something. You know, go to family reunion, play something, do something. So you're trying to really kind of take some of the things you've learned in church and put it together. And that was kind of the beginning of learning music. And then my next sort of journey through music, again, was informally a kind of, and I look at all my methods that I've learned music now and kind of look at it through the lens of Lucy Green and informal music learning, where it's this communal music learning, and there's not as many guides in the room or music educators kind of leading it. And so next was still before I reached the music classroom, was in high school and middle school, where I was involved heavily in rap and hip hop, and it was the '90s. It was the golden era of rap. Everybody thought there was a rapper, and I had my lyrics written down and everything. And so by the time I got to the cafeteria, it wasn't you ate about 3 or 4 minutes, and it was time to rap. You got next to your friend, somebody dropped the beat. All you needed was a pencil and a lunch table, and we kind of go bar for bar in this own form of rapping. And then from those interactions, I learned tempo, time, rhythm, timbre, placement, all these things that I kind of was used to of kind of doing every day that were musical that I didn't really understand at the time. I thought it was just being a part of it. That was kind of my music education at that point. I learned what it meant to be musical and how to integrate and incorporate certain musical aspects. Then the next step was finally the music classroom, and where I got a chance to sit in band in high school and band in middle school and start to become classically trained, I would say. But the thing about it is, about music education, when you grow up in a predominantly African-American community where rhythm and blues and jazz and rap and all those things are just really the dominant voice of what you're hearing. Going to school, you felt a disconnect from what you're doing in music, in the music classroom. You felt like those were two different worlds. This is one world over here where we do this, and this is, where we play, wind literature, string literature, what have you. Luckily enough, though, my band director, who was an African-American woman, my middle school and my high school band director were African-American women, were also able to be the cultural brokers who were able to allow us to live in our one world, that we want to bring in some of those things, elements we were doing on a regular basis in school, and then also integrate some of the great literature and introducing us to kind of a different world. And she was, Peabody grad, really, really well-traveled oboist, played in Russia, played all over the place. And so she had that world experience, that worldly travel to kind of, and also the cultural understanding to come into our community as teachers and help us as our teacher and kind of give us a really good music education. And that made the world of difference and sort of charted my path into instruction. I tell all my students, normally that's one band director, one string director, one choir director that kind of makes you think, okay, I know what I'm going to do now. I'm going to teach music. And that was that teacher. My high school band director was the reason why I said, you know what, I'm going to follow this and go into music. And so my senior year, I was auditioning for schools. A lot of the schools that came to those communities, Black communities in the DC metropolitan area, were historically Black colleges and universities. So we had a lot of HBCUs that were traveling up the coast, going to some of these Black enclaves, these Black neighborhoods, like your DCs, your Philadelphias, Baltimores, Alexandria, some areas that were at the demographic was predominantly African American, and they were looking for students to come to go to school. So I ended up getting a scholarship to go to Bethune-Cookman University in Daytona Beach. And this was right around the time, I think, when the Drumline movie came out. And I saw the Drumline movie, and I was like, I'm sold. I'm going to Bethune-Cookman. They weren't a feature in the movie, but they were in the movie, and they had a couple scenes. And I had just talked to the band director, and I was like, I'm sold. I'm going to live this life, marching band. I'm going to go do this. So moved down to Florida at 17 to do marching band. And again, I had another awakening where these directors and these teachers were also well-traveled and well-experienced and gave us multiple experiences. And I think sometimes when you come out of small communities or come out of communities of color, sometimes you're sometimes unaware of what's out there. Some of those experiences aren't necessarily as privy to some certain communities of color as they are to everyone else. But then I moved to Florida. Most of the chair of the music department's a Florida State grad. the head of the music education is Florida State grad. They've been some places, they've done some things, played some lit, and been to some really well-to-do universities. So that kind of introduced me to another side of music, where I was seeing now bigger institutions and wondering what those institutions were doing and what those students were playing and what it would take to get to these institutions and how to be a part of that world. But it started with Bethune-Cookman University. Did the marching band, did the show band style, loved it. Became a part of my research agenda once I got out of school. And then my next step was to go to Florida State, because most of our staff at the time had graduated from Florida State. So I went to Florida State right after. Went straight into my master's degree, because I did feel as though many HBCU music education programs at times don't necessarily have the same amount of resources as the larger schools. So I decided to go straight to the master's and take a few more classes and really help myself be an even better music educator than I thought I could be. Got a chance to study independent study with Michael Allen, string professor, who changed my whole idea and life about being a string teacher. And he made it fun. He took all the pedagogies and all the high, the technical side of teaching the strings, and he made it fun. And I took an independent study with him, and after that, I said, you know what, I think I'm going to like being a string teacher. Also took a class with Richard Clary, phenomenal wind conductor, who's pretty much who I've molded myself as while I was there. And then I had the opportunity to study with researchers like Clifford Madsen, who changed my outlook on research. And then Dr. Alison Darrow, who really changed my view now on working with, again, disenfranchised populations. But this time I was not working with just communities of color. I was working with students specifically with special needs. And Dr. Darrow really got me excited about working with populations with special needs, divergent learners, students of all cognitive backgrounds. So much so that I got the opportunity to do a separate practicum. Even though I took all my practicums in undergrad, I got to do a specific practicum at Florida State where I was working with students with residual hearing, blindness, deafness, and I got to work with that population. I really kind of fell in love again with working with sometimes underserved populations. So I left there, got a job in Bradenton, Florida, about 40 miles south of Tampa, as a band and orchestra teacher, and in Manatee County. And Manatee County at the time I was there had a band culture, thriving string culture. Manatee High School was probably one of the top football schools in the state of Florida at the time. They had a phenomenal band program. Professor Bruce, who was the band director there, phenomenal string program. And I had a lot of really strong music educators around me who helped me become a really good band and string teacher. So I did that for a few years, enjoyed it. And I got the opportunity to go pursue my doctorate degree on our research grant for what's called a promised neighborhood. And so again, I was kind of diving back into where my roots were, working in disenfranchised communities and working with underserved populations. And that was through what's called a promised neighborhood grant. And a promised neighborhood grant is a grant given by the Department of Education to promise neighborhoods. And these are neighborhoods that are normally historically marginalized, historically disenfranchised, plenty of a lot of students of color, and just facing with some issues that are making it difficult for students to thrive. So I was brought there on a research grant, and I was in Lubbock, Texas, at Texas Tech University. So I was a research assistant there for a few years, did my doctorate, and then was able to complete my doctorate on studying how music educators at historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, how marching band directors at HBCUs and how music ensemble mariachi instructors at Hispanic serving institutions, how these directors act as institutional agents who influence the recruitment of more students of color into higher education. So that kind of became my focus, focusing on what I was doing in Texas, which is Latinx and African American Black students, getting them into higher education. So I graduated from there, had a couple interviews, and ended up getting the job as an assistant professor of music education at Rowan University. My first semester there, I was a professor. Second semester, my chair became the dean, and then I became the coordinator. And then here I am.
All right, so there's so much in there in your story, and I really enjoyed listening to that. But I want to know a couple things here. And one is, you mentioned the idea of cultural practices, and you talked about growing up in the Black church. Can you talk a little bit more about the Black church and what that means as far as creating musicians?
Yeah, I definitely think that the Black church for years has been a hub for turning out musicians and creating more music educators, or more really teachers of music, because that was my first music teaching experience. I learned music in church, and I grew up in Maryland, so Maryland's not as southern as it's not southern as some of the states I've lived in as far as how the church experience differs, because it does differ. But you went and you went to church. You were there all the time. You know, my parents, my dad is Southern Baptist, so you're at church all the time, Monday through Monday, and normally the sanctuary is open, and so you go in there, you play the drums, and because the pastor, and he's gonna let you play, and the drummer's there, and you help him set up, and you come back and you start messing with the PA equipment, the sound equipment. Next thing you know, you're an engineer and you're running the sound for the church. And then I used to go downstairs and record the choirs while they were singing and go check their mics. And next thing you know, I was recording at that time, the cassettes that we would sell at church and the CDs. So I kind of I was a sound engineer. I was a backstage crew. I was a performer, and I was an instrumentalist, all before I ever really stepped foot into a music education classroom. And there was a lot of, it was always cultural. I had a lot to do with the music experience, and the songs we played and the things we did was always kind of wrapped in some form of culture that was relatable, I think, to the type of church. And it's an AME church. I always kind of mention that when I talk about the Black churches, because this specific church was African Methodist Episcopal church. So not Methodist, but also African Methodist, meaning that there was a lot of practices that were traditionally practiced over and over, that was passed on from the time of emancipation all the way till now. And those things still are very prevalent, still present in the church today.
Yeah, we know that no culture is monolithic, but this is certainly something that rings true in a lot of the stories I've heard so far, and so I appreciate that you sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's so much more. The other thing you mentioned is this idea of disconnect in kids. And we know that this is strong in kids from all races and all communities, but it seems particularly strong in marginalized communities. And so what can we do as teachers? I know that you said that you had folks who reached out, you had that band director help bridge that gap, but is there anything advice you can give to teachers about how to reach kids to help bring the band experience or the orchestra experience to the kids in a way that they don't feel like they're disconnected from it?
Absolutely. I mean, it goes back to unfortunately, it goes to the jargon, culturally responsive teaching, critical pedagogy, and all of these methods we're using to connect with our students. But I always teach my students that connecting with your students is and making that music matter outside of your classroom really has to do with you involving yourself in the culture that you're in. And that normally, in my experience, goes beyond race. I've taught in the very, very non settings that were I was the only minority, and I was the director. And I've taught in settings where I've been African American. The predominant culture is Latinx, or I've been African American and a band director in a predominantly African American setting. And there's still layers to those cultures, but what I find is that being culturally responsive in a way that is taking the culture that you're in, becoming a part of it, almost identifying with it, and then bringing those things into the classroom. And what I mean by that is when I was teaching in Bradenton, Florida, which is like the backwoods of Florida, really, I had a lot of kids who were fiddlers. Their parents were fiddlers. Their grandparents were fiddlers. They brought banjos to class. And, this was a music that I didn't grow up listening to. But I became a part of that culture and was able to understand the value of it. And I got the stories from the grandparents and why this violin is so important and why they have to bring the banjo and why he wants to show me this song. And I would invite them into my space and into the class and make that culture the predominant one. Even one thing I've learned about moving from Texas to New Jersey is that in Texas and in the South, it's a Christmas concert, right? And when I moved up north, it's a holiday concert. And I walk into these cultural enclaves not having any defined way of leaning. I lean the way the culture, the community that I'm teaching in leans. If they invited me to come play at a church, in my mind, it didn't matter what my religious beliefs were. I went. When my students who were Latinx invited me to their quinceañeras or invited me to these cultural events, it didn't matter which way. I leaned on the side of the community. And then I brought those things into the classroom. I brought those communal sounds, those communal thoughts, those communal ideas, the dialect. Something as simple as just the dialect that's used is important to students because at times they feel as though their culture, their dialect, or their difference is not admired by their teacher and not brought in to be celebrated. And again, that goes beyond race and how we use it. So I kind of take that and use it anywhere I can in the classroom to help make my students feel comfortable. We call it culturally responsive teaching. We call it critical race theory and how these things all kind of fall in this idea. And that's really how the researchers frame it. They frame it with the jargon, but I think as far as the act of it, it's understanding the value and what we call community cultural wealth that resides in a community, and we're bringing that to light, and we're celebrating that, and we're making that a part of the classroom. So I think that's what I was thinking can be used to help teachers, because we know this is always going to be an issue if there's a white teacher going to a black community and a black teacher going into a white community. And I've had to work in all of those communities, different economic stratas, everything. And I've always made that community the most important element of the classroom. And I think the last thing I'll say on that is I used to always do, when I worked in the South in a predominantly white community, lower socioeconomic, they loved military. They always talked about the parents always talked about being a vet, and their grandfathers, and these things were all very important to them. And so every spring I did my concert, and we always did a concert we were saluting our veterans, and we were thanking the veterans. I would have the vets come up. We had a concert. We would play taps. We'd have this moment. So it was very solemn, but it was a part of the community's culture. All I did was bring that into the classroom to make so they would not see that there was a disconnect. And I think that's the one thing music educators have to do.
Do you think it's an oversimplification to say that by doing this, the students feel seen and they feel like they're being respected in a way that builds connections that allows us to teach better? Is that oversimplifying it?
I don't think so. I don't think it's oversimplifying. I think because it's just what it is, what some of the research says about these students is many of the students with difference, any kind of difference, no matter if it's neurodivergent or if it's economic or if it's racial, they kind of go into these places wondering how they're going to be received and accepted, and wondering if the knowledge and the knowledge they bring to the classroom is valued, or is it esteemed, or is it valued at the same rate as the kid from this economic back strata, or from this kid from this race or this gender or this? And so I think it's I wouldn't necessarily say it's the oversimplification. I kind of agree with the idea that you said.
It's a really interesting thing. I've had two positions where I've been really, I don't know if we want to use the word, the minority culture, the minority person in the room, if that makes sense. And yes. The first was when I finished my doctorate at Florida State. My wife was finishing up hers, and I had a year to teach, and I taught at Florida A&M for a year as an adjunct professor. That was such an amazing experience on so many ways. First of all, it taught me a lot about myself. I don't want to overgeneralize anything, but I really enjoyed my year at FAMU, and I want to talk to you about the HBCU and the role in the band community and what that role what the HBCU plays in our community.
Absolutely. At HBCU, your family. Your family. It don't matter what your race is, what your ethnicity is, what your background. Your family, once you step foot on the HBCU campus, and I'm pretty sure you've had that same experience, because that's just how it is. You know, you kinfolk at the HBCU, and I think that experience it really molds the kind of educators that come out of that program, the kind of people they are, and the kind of educators they are. Because we've always had this thing at an HBCU. We know economically many of the HBCUs are playing from behind. Mm-hmm. And that affects resources, teachers, faculty, everything. But it became a point where, you know, every lesson I had with my applied professor, you know, how are you going to compete at Florida State? How are you going to compete at UF or wherever you go if you can't do it here? It became this, everything was competitive. You had to be in the practice rooms at all time, because we kind of had this mantra, this mindset that all the other universities were stronger than us. They had more than us. They had, you know, more money than us, and they were able to have better instrumentalists too. And so it was it's very, I think, taxing on the faculty sometimes at HBCUs to continue to push their students, because we sometimes would see other schools and be like, oh man, there's no way we're better than them. And that was something that the professors took on themselves to continue to push us, to see our own self as being strong musicians, and also to want more. And then we get around other HBCUs and we'd all push each other, about drumming and about music and everything, so we could continue to be better, because it was always this competition. We've got to be good here, so when we get out there, we're going to be able to compete. So that's one thing. And then there's a nurturing spirit. There's a nurturing spirit there, because HBCUs in general, and even when I was at a Hispanic serving institution, many of these minority serving institutions live off the idea of, or the theory of, racial uplift, or, you know, to empower. And so that also feeds into that confidence, that feeds into that self-affirmation, and those things that kind of prepare you for what the world's going to offer you when you get out. And I think a lot of, to leave a HBCU can be a culture shock if you're not prepared. You know, if you're not prepared to walk into some areas, you're looked at a certain way. And even, you know, it's so funny how times change, because where we are now is still a lot further than 2016. And where we are in 2016 was still a lot further than 2008 and 2010, when I was first walking through some of those institutions that were no longer HBCUs. But HBCUs are sort of the foundation for building many of these young African American music educators who are coming out and trying to sort of find their place and then to fit in. And I would have to say that HBCUs are now becoming a lot more diverse. You know, even though they are historically Black college universities, a lot of people are coming to HBCUs just because of the culture, the nurturing environment that it provides, the faculty. You know, faculty at HBCUs don't close their doors. And I'm sure when you were there, it's weird to watch people walk in your office. They don't even knock. And that kind of culture just creates comfort and nurturing. And I've tried to use some of those same ideas even in my institution now. But I think HBCUs for all disciplines is really sort of what kind of helps that self-pride, that self-empowerment, and kind of preparing the students to feel good about themselves going forward. Again, because when we look at the idea of how we rank and how the research talks about how we rank capital and social strata and social network, we rank these things as one being higher than the other and one being lower than the other and one being more valuable than the other. And so a lot of times when you're dealing with students from lower socioeconomic strata, disenfranchised populations, HBCUs sometimes serve as that force that helps to level those level some of those unsureties we have about who we are. And again, that I always tell my students that goes beyond race, because when I was a mentor at Texas Tech University, many of my students who I mentored were first generation white male students who didn't feel like they fit in. They weren't wealthy like some of the other young white males who had their parents were having them drive to school in Escalades, and their parents owned ranches and oil rigs. You know, a lot of my young white males were parents are blue collar, you know, save their last dollar to put their kids through, and their kids are, you know, getting in school and struggling still because they feel like they don't fit in. They don't feel like they can be a part. And they have the same race, but they still don't feel like they fit in. And so I've seen it from that side too. And so I was able to mentor some of those my young white male students and kind of guide them as well from, again, a nurturing standpoint, understanding who they are and how best to serve them, I should say.
Yeah, I taught university for 15 years, and I have to say that by far the most difficult demographic challenge is the first generation college student, more than any other demographic, in defying race too. Yeah. Because to not have that support system at home, to not have parents who know what it's like, who understand the rules of the game, as my father liked to tell me, that's a big advantage.
It is. And the attrition is so high for those students. I mean, it's unbelievably high. And that's why Mentor Tech was sort of integrated just for those purposes, because the attrition for those kids, it was almost a revolving door.
Yeah, the other thing you mentioned is that during your doctoral studies, you were dealing with populations of special needs students, and that's something that, you know, I've had many experiences over a long teaching career with students. And so, do you have any sort of day-to-day advice? What are best practices for band directors or teachers out there?
Absolutely. It goes back to Dr. Alice Andero's book. It's really the basics. She gave us this little learner. It's called a learner profile. And it had very simple information on there. Knowing the student's name, knowing the student's specific need, just a couple notes from their IEPs or from those meetings that you have to go to, and then understanding the jargon. Parents, when I worked with students with special needs, parents know the literature, they know the jargon backwards and forward. Understanding, staying current with the language that's being used, same way with neurodivergent, same way with cognitive needs or whatever the specific language is. And really just, I think really just staying abreast of what the literature says about working with students with a specific special need. That's one of those things where you have to kind of live in the world of continuously understanding the language, the literature, the research, and keeping up to know how best to serve students with special needs and different backgrounds. I think that's probably the best. Because I mean, it's so funny because you have to almost study it the same way you study a score. I would take I had my kids' notes in my folder, and I would study it, because we all know in class time, that's real time. You don't get to take those words back. You don't get to change when you make a mistake. You have to know how to respond. And so if I had students with emotional behaviors. I could be yelling at a student right next to them, chewing the kid out, and be able to change at the drop of a dime to best serve that student because I remembered. And then the seating, where they sat, if they had residual hearing or if they were deaf, where they were moved, if they were blind. I mean, the score, how it needed to be printed, all those things had to happen in preparation for real-time engagement. And I think that's the one thing that directors have to know is preparation, understanding the jargon, knowing the students.
Yeah, the other thing, Adrian, that you brought up in your conversation was the Hispanic, the Latinx conversation that you had. And now it's been so long since you said that I've kind of forgotten. I've lost my cues. Can you talk a little bit more about what you were doing there at Texas Tech with that community?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I was working in a community called, what was the name of it? The Dunbar Community. It was named after Paul Lawrence Dunbar. And we call it East Lubbock because it was called East Lubbock Promise Neighborhood Grant. But East Lubbock, but the community in specific was called the Dunbar Community. And this was a community that was historically African-American and was now turning to Latinx. Now, something so interesting about this that I didn't learn until I moved there and kind of became a part of the culture was East Lubbock was split by Martin Luther King. And Lubbock, Texas was the last city in the United States to desegregate.
Wow.
And they were the last city in the United States to desegregate. And they all the time lived beyond Martin Luther King, and everyone else lived in the west side of Lubbock. Well, you keep digging and you try to figure out why that is, because sometimes it's like they're just communities, people migrate to one areas. Well, for Lubbock, that was an ordinance in place by the mayor of Lubbock a long time ago. Maybe I forgot because I was just looking at the document. But this was an ordinance that if you had even an eighth of African-American blood, you were not allowed to live beyond Martin Luther King. And that area became the Dunbar Community later, about 100 years later. And so this grant, this Promised Neighborhood Grant, was supposed to bring the community closer to the institution. The institution was supposed to be connecting East Lubbock to West Lubbock, connecting the university, and what they were using were graduate assistants as these liaisons between the community. Well, that was good, but it also became a problem because I was one of the only African-American males, at least, on that grant. So the issue they were having with these liaisons, these people who were working in the community, were that we did not have enough people of color in getting their doctorate degree at that time who could be a part of something like this. And that kind of was just a reflection of how there's still a imbalance of people of color getting higher ed degrees to be able to make change and impact into their own communities and other communities of color. So I was working there in a community that was predominantly African-American and now was about 50-50 African-American and Latinx, but were happily integrated together. And so I was placed at two schools. I first started at the middle school because the first year of the grant, they wanted to start at the middle school and kind of venture off into high school and venture off into elementary school. So I started at the middle school, providing after-school enrichment activities. We had a couple times we collected data during events, but it was mainly my was to organize and create after-school music enrichment activities. I also had to participate in summer activities, all about keeping the kids in the schools year-round. And even I did summer school. I was paid to teach math and do anything that could be done in the community. And the main issue is the arts is always the last one to kind of join the party. When there's money to be had for education, there's money for technology, there's money for STEM, there's money for everything. And the money for the arts normally comes at the end. So my first year on the grant, I was teaching math and these after-school enrichment with other math teachers and art teachers, and really integrating my own sort of discipline into as much as I could, but that was the first year. And then the second and third year, these became big art summer and music programs that we were kind of involved in. And it was all about keeping the students off the streets year round, after school enrichment, arts enrichments, getting them to the university, which was one of the biggest, probably one of the bigger goals. There are many kids who lived, and Lubbock, Texas is not like, it's not like New York, where Queens is far from Manhattan. We're talking about 10 minutes away, and some of these students had never been on the campus of Texas Tech University. And so that was one of the big goals, was to get the kids on the campus. Another goal was to get faculty into the community. And so something I saw at Texas Tech that I hadn't seen at other institutions, where the deans were in the communities as well, active. And that's something that was new to me, because I most times when I got to bigger institutions, I never saw the dean. I knew them in email, but I never actually met them. And this particular grant, faculty, they were kind of removing the ivory tower, and everyone kind of had a hands on deck in working with the community. So we did. I did a show style drumline. We did steel pan. We did elementary music. I mean, it was pretty much any after school enrichment, arts, music, theater activity that we could do. That's what we did, and we did that year around.
How would a band director like me, if I wanted to do something like that, address the issues of cultural authenticity to start ensembles like that?
It kind of goes back to my earlier point about starting in the community, because in my dissertation, one of the directors of a mariachi in California was a white male. And he had a pretty good mariachi program, but it had nothing to do with his ethnicity, his race. He just loved the music, and that's kind of what he did. But it starts with the community. I would recommend before, because mariachi is one of those things I learned in my dissertation. Not everyone esteems mariachi music, depending on the economic strata. Some view mariachi as lower class music, and some view mariachi as, truly cultural and mirroring the best of specific cultures in the Latinx diaspora as far as it relates to Mexican origin. So it really starts with the community, because you don't want to bring something into the community that's not necessarily wanted or valued. So maybe you go into your community first before you think about starting. You go listen to a couple of mariachi, find some mariachi performers, see what their connection with the school, have them come to the school, have them play for the students. You can't just jump into something like that, because you have to develop that culture for it. And what I mean by that is, I had a lot of students who were of Mexican origin who anything cultural, they did not want you to bring in. They did not want you to bring into the classroom, because they had not gotten through when I teach my students in my instruction and assessment class, we talk about how students of different backgrounds go through assimilation, marginalization, removal, and then acceptance. There's assimilation. There's a lot that goes on with your students of color, different backgrounds, that they need to first accept and appreciate about themselves before we can bring something that they may not be necessarily comfortable with. So when I started playing mariachi music, a lot of my students were vehemently did not want me to play it. They didn't want me to play it. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to hear about it. They wanted to assimilate and fit into the predominant culture. And they felt like that was something that was not allowing them to kind of normalize. So again, that's why I didn't. And then I had to look at that and say, okay, I can't just jump right into this. I need to create a culture for this first. I need to bring the community into the school first to figure out how best to approach something like this. Now, and everyone has a different approach. Some people say, well, I don't care. This is good music. You should be appreciative. You should be proud of it. And I'm going to bring it to the school. And that's their approach. I've worked in a lot of different communities with a lot of different people, and I've always tempered and was very careful and very delicate when we're talking about cultural appropriation, authenticity in culture. All those things matter, and if you're too quick to try to jump into something you just don't necessarily have the insight on, and you're still a cultural outsider, you stand the chance of kind of being called that's not authentic, or trying to fit it, or just starting doing it from a way that's not actually authentic, even though you are being authentic. And so my advice to any person who's going to try to incorporate any music that could be considered cultural is to go out to the community first. Spend some time in their community, understand what the community is. And one of the articles that I'm working on now talks specifically about working outside of the music classroom. In the summer times, even now, I spend a lot of my time taking my music with me into the nonprofit, into community-based organization, into community-based initiatives, into different historical communities, and then trying to figure out where I fit, become a part of it, where I fit, and how to bring light to their music and their values, and then integrate it seamlessly into an activity, an ensemble, or something like that. But you have to be very, very careful. Even I do when walking into African American communities. African American communities are not as religious as they used to be 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. So I can't make the assumption that everyone has, this history or this background growing up in the church. I would probably say 50 years from now, that might not be a case. I talk to a lot of young African American kids now, and they're talking about energy crystals and sage and different. I mean, I'm like, it's a culture shock for me. I'm like, wow, this is new. But the one thing that I'm sure of is that because I always do a lot of listening to the music as far as hip hop goes, but the fact that I still, even in the hardest, kind of grimiest hip hop, you still see this reflection to, or this kind of understanding of religion against what they're doing in their lifestyle and stuff like that. It still makes me think, okay, we're still talking about religion, we're just not doing it the same way. So I say that to say that just you're being very careful about how you integrate or involve any ensembles or cultural music.
That's really interesting. I appreciate your perspective on these things. It's refreshing to hear. It's nice. It's a good conversation. I appreciate that, Adrian.
Not a problem.
So we've done a lot of talking about sort of philosophical issues. I haven't really asked you about what you're doing as a band director. What do you do at Rowan right now as far as band stuff?
Sure. It's funny because when you get here, you become the researcher,
right?
And you become the pedagogue. And I'm really just an old timey band director at heart. And I probably have to thank the South for that, because I didn't become an old timey band director until I moved down south. Down south is just a very different type of band director and teacher. And so I kind of always think about my old timey band director ways. But what I do every year I do the middle school band festival. I'm an adjudicator, and I get a chance to listen to some of the best middle school bands in South Jersey. We listen to them. I give them a grade. I give them a recording. I get on stage and I get to work. Every other semester, I conduct the concert band. I think this year was a symphony band. A couple of years ago, I did a Granger piece, and then this year I did another. I forgot what piece it was because it was so long ago. But about every other year, I'll conduct the symphony band. I do the middle school every year, middle school band festival, South Jersey Band Festival every year. And this year, I actually got a chance to. I was invited to do the Bucks County, that's in Pennsylvania, and Bucks County is a really well-to-do county. Bucks County Youth Orchestra. I was a guest conductor for that this year. Unfortunately, I was not able to do that this year because of the pandemic. But I think it takes you a while, but eventually you get back into it. You get back into the band world, into the orchestra world. I know my first year here, I was asked to do a elementary orchestra festival, but I had just got here. I wasn't necessarily prepared to do that yet, so I didn't. But I think the longer I'm here, the more I get my name out and the more students I teach, I've been invited a lot more. And when I first got here, I was just wanting to get out into the class, get out and teach as soon as possible. But it takes some time. I had to kind of learn the lay of the land, understand the populace I was teaching in and the teachers and faculty. But now that I've got a nice, I know a lot of the directors in the area. I get invited to do a lot of things. So I think that's only going to continue, especially in the string world as well. I will say this, though. I will say this, as a percussionist who is a string teacher, you do have to work a little bit harder to get into the string world. I mean, I've had to I was a really good string teacher. And I think that's what kind of led me into a lot of spaces, because oftentimes, if you're not a string player, sometimes it's a little bit hard to crack into that world depending on what part of the country you're in.
Hey there, everyone. My name is Ann Molesky, and I'm the host of the Anna Krusick Podcast, another podcast in the Muted Network. It's my mission to help music teachers be more purposeful, sequential, and joyful in each and everything they do as teacher musicians. Join me every Thursday as I share tips, tricks, and meaningful conversations with other music teachers about how to make the general music classroom more intentional and impactful for both you and your students.
Where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
I think we draw the line at morale. What does it do for the kids? Because I am competitive by nature. I'm a percussionist. I believe in competition. I do believe a little pressure, a little pushing helps students to at least realize and understand their full potential. But we're in an age now where we have to be cognizant and careful with our students' mental health and their morale. I spend a lot, I will push my students and I'll push them, and competition is good. But when I feel like we're getting too close to a student taking on, defeat harder than they should, taking on losing or not getting the score, or not, when they're looking at, old music ed product versus process sort of thing, and the process the product becomes more valuable than the process, I think we have to kind of look at how we're pushing our students. We do have to push them, but individually we need to know where our students are, who they are, and how best to differentiate what we're doing to still get that same competition and continue to push them, but being cognizant of the morale. 20 years ago, we wouldn't say that. In the 90s, we didn't say that, but we're dealing with a different populace. And I don't ever want to break a student, and I don't ever want to be responsible for breaking a student. So I think that line is morale. Clifford Matson always said, what was your goal in music education for your students? What was your goal? What was your purpose? And everybody would raise their hand and say, to be the best music educator, top band, top this, and be the best this. And he said his goal was that 20 years from now, when he saw that kid again, if he knocked on their door and looked over their shoulder, there was a piano in the room, that there was a case on the floor, that somebody was continue to push their kids to go through music. And if we want to continue to keep music education thriving and alive and keep our students in it, we've got to really understand who is in our classroom and how best to push them and be competitive without breaking.
So, Adrian, how do you find a work-life balance in a career as a music teacher?
Work-life balance. And that's a hard one, because we're educators, but we're musicians. And being a musician is a relentless attempt to be better, to better your craft. And so I would say that work-life balance is actually giving yourself time to have balance. Because if I wanted to, I could spend my entire day looking up literature, preparing my classes, practicing, conducting, reading my articles, and I could actually live like I lived by myself. Now, that would probably get me in a lot of trouble, but I could. And so I think really just understanding that you need time for yourself. You need time to break away. You need time for family. You need time for your own personal well-being. I think that's the hardest thing to do, to make yourself believe that. Because most musicians, we don't even believe you need that. We say, I'll just keep practicing. I'll keep working. And we're very good at doing it because we're used to spending 6-7 hours in a practice room anyway. Hopefully 6 or 7 hours in a practice. So drive, like Daniel Pink, is very easy for us because it's what we've been doing for a very long time. So I would say that telling yourself that tomorrow's not, just because you lose some time out of the day doesn't mean you've lost it forever, that you can't get it back, or that you can't fix something or work on something. Take your time, try to integrate times to just relax and just kind of brain breaks. That's kind of the best. It's hard for me to even say that because I know right now if I wanted to, I can go from 9 to 3 in the morning. But I've got to make myself get away. And I think that's the hardest part, making yourself take a break. Be good to yourself.
No question. I'm struggling with that right now because we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic for those who are listening in the future. And, we're home all the time. I just want to work constantly, and it's really taxing.
And it's easy to do it because we're used to doing it.
Yeah, and when you're stuck at home, it becomes almost something to do.
Yep.
So, yeah, no doubt about that. All right, Adrian, here's a big one. What are the challenges facing music education and band, and how can we best meet some of those?
One of the biggest challenges facing band and to a large extent music education is the lack of diversity. And what I mean by that is, and there was just a study done by a professor at TC&J, College of New Jersey, when they're talking about how the numbers of people of color in music education, band world in general, choral, choir, choral, string, is just falling and falling. And that's for kids of color as well. And what frightens me about that is, as we're preparing for the demographic shift, which is already started, and it's really going to become more clear between 2040 and 2060, when you have an increase in even Asian Pacific Islander, indigenous people who are surprisingly going to have, I think it's like 8%, African American population 13%, the Latinx population as much as 45 to 50% population shift, and we're still not finding ways to get that demographic in the classroom. I think that's going to be the bigger issue. That the 80-20 or 20% is supposed to be in the ensemble is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller until we find ways to recruit students of color into our classrooms. We need more teachers of color who are music educators in our classroom. That starts by having more students in there of color who want to be a teacher. That comes with being culturally responsive, culturally aware, looking at the curriculum, what we're teaching. Is it culturally relevant literature, culturally relevant ideas? Is it a culturally relative pedagogy? How are we giving this information? How are we teaching this? Getting our students now, if they're not of color, to understand the importance of having, students of color in their ensembles and around them. I think that's going to be important, as well as looking now at the technological side of music education. Look at TikTok and these dance moves and the songs and everything that's happening. We're seeing more music experiences, or more the idea of create, perform, respond. We're seeing that everywhere else. And it gets to our classrooms. For some reason, the students don't see it that way. They see this as different. So I think integrating more virtual ideas, more technology, more non-traditional, and I know that scares a lot of people, but more non-traditional ensembles, or more kind of like Brian Powell up at, I think, TC&J. The little kids, the informal music lesson, the informal rock, those kind of things that are really going to attract students, I think is what's going to be important. Really trying to diversify not only who is in our classroom, but what we're offering. So I think that's going to be, if the majority of the population is going to be of diverse backgrounds, and we're still teaching things that don't reflect them, that is going to be our biggest Achilles heel. By no means am I saying that we should not be teaching the greats, the classics, and everything else. You're talking to somebody who, I would listen to hardcore rap and then go to a Bach fugue easy on Pandora. So I'm not saying that those things need to go, but I'm saying we need to open up the ideas of bringing in new ways of teaching. And I honestly think this pandemic is helping. It's helping us look at music education and access to music education a little different, and how to include some of these virtual things in the music education classroom. So I think diversifying on all fronts, diversifying our population, diversifying our teaching approaches, our pedagogical approaches, technological savviness, all those things are going to matter, because the vision is here, right? We're here in Vision 2020 now. We're here now, and we really got to start to look at how we're addressing those concerns of that symposium.
So I invented Time Machine, and I set it to the day of your high school graduation. What advice you given yourself?
High school graduation. Let's see. What advice would I give myself? I would say go to as many concerts as you can. Develop your ear. Develop your ear. Go listen to a lot of people. Go listen to whatever string orchestra or ensemble is in town. Go listen to them. Please go listen to them. As that became the most important thing in my teaching, was just developing my analytical ear, as Lucy Green says. Next thing I would say is, don't be afraid of any other musician. Don't let the fear of you thinking that a musician is better than you stop you, or that fear that you think that you're not as strong as other musicians because they went to this school and you went to that school. Don't let that stop you from getting all the way to the top, or getting as far as you'd like to go. And it's always good to be thinking three. Practice.
Man, that fear thing really dominated my my early music career. Fear of failure, then fear of success. It all plays together.
Oh yeah, it'll make you give up before you've even start the race.
Yep, absolutely, no doubt of that. All right, Adrian. So this question is meant to kind of get at what piece of music is most meaningful to you, as opposed to like your favorite, because we all have favorite things, but I mean something that really resonates with you. And so if you had a choice, what would be the final work for wind ensemble or band that you'd want to conduct, and why? And I always extend this. If you want to make it something outside of the band realm, that's fine too.
It'd probably have to be New World Symphony, because I got a chance to go to Dvořák's grave, and I got a chance to, when I was in Prague, go to his grave and his house and his museum. And I really love the song. And I think one thing I liked about Dvořák, he said a lot of things that were kind of like ahead of his time when he talked in regard to race, in regard to Black music. You know, he thought that Black music had a lot of really interesting sounds, really cool. You know, he kind of admired it or talked about it as an American art form, and that stuck with me because it's not many. You can't find too many people back then who kind of spoke highly of Black music. I'm sure you can find me dig through, but I remember I used to read Mozart diaries. Those are the weirdest things to read when I was at Florida State, because Florida State's library, you can get any book you want. But I read one of Mozart's diaries, and it's right before his mother passed, and he was talking about his father was telling him that you need to go see the Moor in France. You've got to go see this Black composer, St. George. You got to go meet him. He's a great person. And that was like the one time when I said, oh, wow, look, somebody's talking about a Black composer. But, fast forward, Dvořák was talking about, Black music and how he uses some of those elements in his music. And I thought that was just really powerful to say as someone who's an outsider, kind of looking in. But that song it's a really beautiful song. And, in my days of public school teaching, when I'm watching pencils fly across the room, I always thought when we played that song, I was like, man, I would love to be on like a big stage with a big orchestra. And it's like me and Chili Badaki, and we're just both there, bowing and getting ready to conduct.
All right, Adrian, is there anything coming up? And I know we're in the middle of COVID-19, so this is kind of a strange question right now, but is there anything coming up that you'd like to share or promote?
It's another thing coming up. I would say I'm working on a few articles. I think one is coming up. I'm hoping it gets published. When you go down the publishing route, it could be today, it could be 2 years from now. But another article I'm working on is talking about music educators as institutional agents. And I'm really getting music educators to step out. I'm talking about stepping outside of the music classroom, getting involved in communities of color, and getting involved with your music talents in nonprofit and community-based initiatives. I think there's a need for music educators in those worlds because a lot of the people who are teaching and some of these music teachers who are teaching and some of these after-school enrichment, nonprofit, community-based, grant-funded things are not musicians. They're not music educators. They're kind of persons in the neighborhood who play music really well and got a chance to do some things, and now they're teaching, which is great, and we enjoy that. But again, a music educator needs to be involved in that world as well, outside of the traditional classroom. That K-12, we need to also be in some of these more communal events. And that's one of the articles I'm working on that hopefully, fingers crossed, after a couple of edits, it'll finally be out, and then people can read that. Also do things with Urban Teacher Academy. So I've got some things coming out there and talking about how to, again, go back into communities of color and create more teachers, whether they be music educators, math teachers, what have you. So those are the two things I'm kind of working on now. All
right, Adrian, how can people get in touch with you?
They can get in touch with me through multiple ways. Of course, my social media, Facebook, Barnes, BARNESAD @rowan.edu. Email me or go to rowan.edu, Google Adrian Barnes, the guy with the bow tie, and email me, and we can talk music ed stuff, or we can talk orchestra stuff, or philosophy, or whatever you want to do.
Excellent. Adrian, thank you so much for the conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.